Hot Water History, episode 140, Saturday. Better late than never. Richard, what's going on?
Delayed gratification here.
It's true. I was just in Texas for the week, which is a large part why we're doing this so late. Have you ever been to Buc-ee's?
No,
Do you know what Buc-ee's is?
no.
Wow. Okay. Let me tell you about Buc-ee's then. Buc-ee's is the best part of America. It is this chain of convenience stores. And have you ever been to Quick Trip in Wisconsin?
Yes. Yes, I have.
So think about a Quick Trip in Wisconsin, but on steroids. Let me try to pull this
Oh,
up.
interesting. I love Quick Trips because they have spotted cow in Wisconsin or anything from
So
Glarus.
it's more like a Walmart than. So this is the sky view. So these are all gas stations and car washes, and then they have the main building. And in the main building, there's pretty much everything you want in there. There's people that cook for you in the convenience store. Candy, pretty much any soda flavor you'd want.
I like their outfits. I would wear that just out and about.
But being from Chicago, I couldn't comprehend all of that.
Everything's bigger in Texas.
Everything runs well. The
Yes.
staff, the staff is super friendly.
Mm.
It's huge.
Is that because of a prevalence of free market enterprise in Texas, or is it simply something that's more cultural?
I think it's both.
Okay, good answer. What would you say it's more of?
I think it's more free market.
Mm,
The
okay.
free market.
Yeah.
There's at the old, I forgot what's the hospital they took Kennedy
Uh,
when he got
Dallas
shot.
General? I don't I don't know.
Okay, well, I
Dallas
forgot. But
Memorial.
the old version of that is basically a they basically converted the old hospital. I think even before, I think Kennedy was the newer hospital, but the older Dallas hospital, they converted into a lot of these financial buildings where it's a mix of these small financial companies that work out of there and these offices. And
Okay.
it's a mix of that. And then also like an American history museum, but more of a more of an American propaganda type
Ooh.
deal. Washington, D.C. for the South. But they do have an amazing statue. And I don't remember who the statue is, but they have all these quotes on each side of the statue. And one of them was John Smith. And it's a quote from him that says, "Man lives by exchanging."
Mm. How fitting for our topic tonight then.
Yes, that's why I wanted to bring it up because I was
Yeah.
thinking about our what we were going to talk about tonight as I was looking at this session. I thought you would never see us quote like that anywhere prevalent in Chicago.
No. In fact, I've seen the quotes that are most prominently displayed as propaganda and indoctrination today. I saw riding in on the Eisenhower into the city today. Get this one, Charlie. I don't know if you've seen this one. Welcome to Chicago, where abortion is healthcare.
Yeah, that's everywhere. It's everywhere here.
Talk about
That's
some
the billboard coming
version.
into the city.
Right.
And they have it in Bridgeport down Archer. So I see that, but it's a rotating billboard, but I see it all the time.
Right. Is it not something of it's almost thing that makes me think that there's going to be a great static explosion when you get these very charged elements within culture that are polarized and by their nature essentially opposite. So you have the beauty, grace, otherworldliness, transcendental nature of the beautiful churches of the city and the communities still, the remnants still therein, the faithful. And then you have the murderous, wicked, sinister obliterators of the image of God in its most vulnerable state, attacking the foundations of natural law, human love implanted in the human conscious and heart. And where where is that most evident than when the demons and Satan himself wishes to tear apart the perhaps the most beautiful and intimate relationship, that of mother and child, through this most sinister and despicable act. And then to have it celebrated and thrown in the face, it is very Orwellian in the sense that you're told to, in 1984, simply assert that what your eyes and ears were seeing and hearing was not true. So it's been gradual, but then all of a sudden, that when I was growing up, we didn't really hear much about abortion, even though it was obviously taking place. And even among its most fervent advocates and defenders, for example, in the Clinton administration, even out of President Clinton's own mouth, when he spoke, and Democrats by and large spoke of abortion, they wanted to make it the triad of safe, legal, and rare. That was their stance on abortion. Well, go down a little bit further, less than 3 decades later, and it's now to be lauded. And even the definition of it transformed into healthcare. I mean, how absurd is it and outlandishly sinister and evil that you wouldn't define, for example, cosmetic surgery as healthcare? And that's superficial by definition, right? And yet, the extermination of a human being within its his or her mother's womb is considered healthcare. So you have this, yes, inverted definition. You wouldn't, in other words, you wouldn't call it, although it's clear that the left is moving this way, and the abortion crowd is moving this way, because they keep talking about healthcare, and they're extending the definition of female healthcare and mental health into this allowance that if a mother is suffering from debilitating, what they might define even as crippling, a type of identity crisis, well, then they're less culpable for killing their already born child. So it's not a stretch that they would there go justify exterminating the life of the child that isn't seen or can't be heard.
Yeah, there wasn't any of those signs in Texas. I didn't
I
see.
wouldn't think
Yeah,
so.
I didn't see. There was a lot of pride stuff in Dallas.
Sure.
You'd have been. I was surprised, at least, that
Mm,
it had gotten that far south.
yeah.
But
Well, what didn't the whole drag queen story hour wasn't Dallas a center of that?
yeah,
Yeah. So
it's not just something we're dealing with. It's going on every major city in America is dealing with it. It's not, we're
Right.
not we're
Although,
not unique in Chicago with a lot
yes,
of these
well,
issues we
maybe
talk
it's
about.
maybe to transition to the piece that we're going to speak of and analyze today. If the forces of anti-civilization and the forces that seek to obscure, even destroy the goodness of human nature and the, again, image of God and the likeness of God made within each human person are so bold as to proclaim their message, no matter how destructive it is, in a culture that is predominantly against them and contrary, working against them, the predominant culture is such. Well, shouldn't we take solace and be all the more encouraged that we should fly the anarcho-capitalistic flag, the ANCAP flag, in a place like Chicago? In other words, rather than be discouraged that there are pride parades and drag queen story hour and, I don't know, a Texas Communist Party somewhere in the Fort Worth area, that should all the more embolden us to be the capitalist, Catholic, anti-government, anti-monopoly of violence entities in a place where the culture continually sings the refrain of further state intervention and the mollification of the minds of individuals, and always in favor of the state and the collective.
Do you want to talk about the piece first, or do you want me to talk about Mexican Independence Day?
Actually, let's use the experience of Mexican Independence Day to launch into the Hans-Hermann Hoppe piece that we'll talk about. Because
Okay,
I don't think they're irrelevant. There's a there's a strong
I
connection
think
between
so
the two.
too. Yeah, I
Okay.
think we're gonna have similar thoughts.
Let's develop
Anyways,
that then.
Mexican Independence Day. Not exactly, not exactly a great representation of how Chicago normally is.
Mhm.
The worst time to be on the road. And last Saturday night, I happened to be in Wrigleyville watching some of the UFC fights, and we're gonna have to draw out a little bit of the Chicago geography here. So Wrigleyville
We
is
want to just
up.
post a map.
Wrigleyville, we can draw this out. Wrigleyville is up north. Okay. Bridgeport, the south side, where I'm from, is down south. In the middle, you got the downtown area, and out west, you have places like Oak Park. What the first western suburb is pretty much Oak Park. Because of what was going on, and what was going on is not really a celebration of a country, but more just a free for all. And you'll find just honking horns. You've got all of the Mexican flags out of the windows of cars, cars flying around, people yelling. I saw a girl twerking at a red light on the way back. I saw another girl basically sitting on the window in the passenger seat of the highway.
Mhm.
Just cars are going 90 miles an hour. I'm freaking out because I'm trying not to get hit. Hopefully, none of these people are too drunk. And as I'm coming down to Bridgeport from Wrigleyville, I see that streets are starting to get closed off. So I'm going down Lakeshore Drive down south, and exits are being blocked off. There's probably two cop cars at every exit. And I'm thinking, okay, they probably have shut down some streets here in the downtown area. As I get closer and closer to 18th Street, more and more exits. There's nowhere to get off. And so they start directing us back to 290. And I get to a point where I start pulling over because I'm going to finally talk to a cop, which is rule number one that I broke, talking to cops. I spoke to a police officer, rolled down the window because there's a bunch of people figuring out what's going on. So I'm kind of in line. And so I'm at the side of the road and I kind of overshot the exit. So I'm backing up basically on the interstate. I wasn't in danger, but I'm backing up to talk to a cop. And I rolled down my window and this cop's just, of course, this cop, first thing he says is, "What are you doing backing up on the highway? What are you doing?" Just give me that. I said, "I'm trying to get out." And I live in Bridgeport and I'm all the way down here. Why is that? He goes, "You got to go to Mannheim."
Mannheim.
Mannheim. "You got to go to Mannheim." I go, "Okay." And then we're kind of just, there's not much else that's going to happen. I'm not going to get much else out of that interaction. This dude's already mad at me. And you ended up not having to go to Mannheim. You ended up having to get off at Austin, but you're taking side roads to get onto 55. I didn't take 290 back. I took 55 back and finally got off. And 55 at, call it 12:30 at night on Mexican Independence Day was the craziest driving experience I think I've ever had.
Mm-hmm.
It was Grand Theft. It felt like Grand Theft Auto on that highway for a bit there.
Right.
And I'm saying some prayers. I'm asking my guardian angel to. I was thinking to myself, this would be such a lame way to go.
Look at this gringo.
Car crash.
Gringo got caught on
Gringo
55.
gets smashed on 55 during Mexican Independence Day. That would have been a brutal way to go. But we made it and we get to talk about it now.
We sure do. There are a couple things that I draw from your experience. First of all is I am always taken aback, and these celebrations of Mexican independence in Chicago over the course of my lifetime here have just escalated more and more and more. It's as if there's a competition from year to year to outdo the insanity from the prior year. And if you notice this year, what was ubiquitous was on every Chevy Camaro or muscle car owned by a Mexican, they had the hood wrapped Mexican flag. And the Mexican flag is being flown out of every Mexican owned pickup truck. So I would say maybe 1 out of 10, maybe 1 out of every 8 cars have this emblazoned on them or on the hood. And I couldn't help but think, as it's a weird experience when you actually work, as I had for a long time with Mexican immigrant laborers, is the span of their appreciation of what or how they feel about being and living in America or in the United States. So there is this, it's a wide spectrum, to be sure, but the ones that were always very pro-Mexican and nationalistic and always playing ranchero music straight from Durango, and those that would even get so specific as to get into arguments with other Mexican guys as to what province was better in Mexico. Like if a guy was from Chihuahua, or if another guy was born in Veracruz, or if another guy was born in Chiapas, as opposed to Durango, they'd all get in fights about that, which is sort of natural and a kind of rivalry. But what is striking to me is that, and someone mentioned this, I can't remember who in this experience. I think it wasn't Tyler Cowen. Who's the guy who wrote The Case for Education? Why is his name escaping me now? He's at George Mason.
Yeah, the
When
George Mason guy. How are we
yeah,
forgetting this?
I don't know, but I'm blanking. Um, I'm sure you probably have a piece by
I
him around
definitely
it.
do.
Case for Education. Well, anyway,
We'll pull it
his name will
up.
pop. Oh, Brian Kaplan. Brian
Yeah.
Kaplan. It just popped in my mind. Okay, so I think it was Brian Kaplan on the Tom Woods episode recently said, well, what's fascinating is that, or maybe it's Tom himself was talking about this, is like, well, if you're even working for a time, if you emigrated to a country, it's really, at least Americans, and I think this is also a Western European thing, is that you want to go way out of your way to genuinely enculturate yourself and be extraordinarily respectful and even deferential to the native culture or to the culture you're in a contemporary way living in and working within. So it's not like you're going to be wearing the American flag or you don't see the French flag flying around in Morocco. If someone was to go jaunt off to Rabat or Casablanca for a weekend or Tangier for a weekend. Conversely, however, you have these sometimes third, second world countries and immigrants come here. And it just always hit me as being odd. Why are you celebrating a country you left? It's as if, for example, I move out of Chicago. I already detest major aspects of the life and culture here. And one of the primary reasons I would move is because of the economic circumstances that are so crippling and they are choking off free enterprise and expansion, innovation, entrepreneurship, all this stuff. So if I move to, let's say, Dallas, I'm not going to be flying the Chicago flag around. And when people would say to me, well, you got a weird accent, or you have this weird demeanor, or you like, or the stereotypical, you like the deep dish pizza or whatever, which isn't okay, a real Chicago thing. But I would just say, yeah, I don't really identify. I mean, I'm from there, but I moved here for a reason. It's because I like it here more. Correct. So you moved to Chicago, or you moved to, in this, we're talking about Mexican immigrants to Chicago. And the first thing that you do is celebrate the Independence Day of the country you abandoned because it didn't provide you. It's not as though Mexico is this sort of barren wasteland with no natural resources and an incapacity, and even one that's perpetually and without question historically without precedent for economic vitality, because there have been periods of economic vitality in Mexico. Well, it's not as if it's this barren wasteland where there's no possibility for leading a good, propitious life, right? And a happy one at that. So something else has to be at play there. I mean, a case in point is that Mexico just elected, and by the way, Mexicans living abroad are allowed to vote in Mexican elections so long as they retain their citizenship, which nearly all of them do. So they voted in as a president elect an openly communistic Jewish woman, an openly communist Jewish woman, Claudia Scheinbaum, I think her name is. So what are you celebrating? You left. Is it just tribal? Is it just that this is an identification by which I share with pretty much everyone in my neighborhood? And so we use this as an excuse to go and celebrate. But it's an odd thing to celebrate. It's as if it, it's as if speaking of baseball fandoms and allegiances, everyone knows I long jumped off and have been actively aboard a pirate ship trying to sink the Chicago White Sox. I've gone off that ship, and everyone around me, let's say I moved to Bridgeport and there were a bunch of people who are Sox fans on my block, and the White Sox, there's a White Sox fest, which by the way they canceled because they can't handle the fan complaints, but they had one. And I would say, well, I'm going to fly a White Sox flag because, well, that's what everyone else is doing. I think this is the most simplistic, but also asinine type of tribalism, because anyone thinking with a concern about not being self-contradictory would simply say the last flag I would fly if I was a Pakistani immigrant to New York would be waving around the Pakistani flag on Pakistani Independence Day. Why would I care? I left there. Same thing with Mexican Independence Day.
I don't think it's an organic.
You
I don't think it's
seem
an organic movement.
You think it's organic?
I don't think it's an organic movement.
Okay, so what's behind it?
I don't know, but I don't think this is all just a grassroots play.
So what elements would benefit cui bono from intensifying this nationalistic sentiment for people who are away from the country? Is it that, well, one could argue that institutionally speaking, they're going through public schools, and the public schools are indoctrinating Mexicans to be more patriotic toward Mexico, even though they're here, than they are to the United States. Is that I'm just throwing out a possibility?
Yeah,
there.
that's kind of what I'm getting at. Is that
Okay? And furthermore, if in their limited attendance in the high school history classes, they're told that a, a very one-sided view of the Mexican American War, for example, they would come to the conclusion that all American administrations were out to get and take massive swaths of Mexican territory from the onset in this wild, American gringo enterprise of first killing the Indian, then killing the Mexican as the United States expanded westward. That analysis isn't too far off from the truth. But if you're only hearing one side, and then rather than seeing Juan Lopez de Santa Anna as someone who bumbled his way through successive wars and regimes, then and is only seen as a victim, and you never hear that Benito Juarez was not just a poor Indian who rose to prominence in Mexico, but was also a socialist and a criminal, then yeah, I guess we're diagnosing. I think we're putting the finger on the origin or the genesis of this.
just think about all the non-American flags we've seen this decade between Ukraine, Israel, Palestine,
Sure.
Mexico. Those four. If you haven't flown any of those four flags, you might be in the minority.
Right. The happy minority, because you've not been propagandized to the point of blindness and deafness. I mean, this is the weird thing about you brought up. Let's take those four countries that you listed. Israel, you have to have a willful or Orwellian blindness to the fact that they're carrying out what would otherwise be termed by any other perpetrator as a mass terrorist attack against people in a sovereign nation, Hezbollah fighters supposedly in Lebanon, by blowing up their pagers. And what do they get? No reprobation from, or little to no reprobation from, anyone outside the Middle East for this massive terrorist attack. Children were killed in this. Then the Ukraine, Slava Ukraine. You got the Congress of the United States flying the Ukrainian flag, elevating the Ukrainian flag above the American flag in the halls of Congress. So of course you have this misplaced Ukrainian nationalism, and the causes to defend democracy, small independent Ukraine from the totalitarian clutches of Putler, right? And then you have to have that willful blindness being extremely active to the point of singing a cacophony of songs to blind you from the reality of the guy just outlawed the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. He suspended elections. He's operating in a much more totalitarian, dictatorial fashion than Hitler ever dreamed of. And he's getting his keys from the Azov Brigade, who happen to be actual Nazis. Then Mexico, I mentioned that they just, many Mexicans who I know, who I worked alongside, are extremely industrious, extremely hardworking. And the sort of generation X, my age, and maybe just a little younger, and then above that, they by and large look back at Mexico and they have a fondness for its culture and its kind of people and language and their way of life, but they realize that it's an economic shithole. And so, in many cases, where it really shouldn't be, given again the resources at its disposal. But all that being the case, they work hard and they appreciate the at least more capitalistic environment, the opportunities that are presented here from an economic and job opportunity perspective. They don't, but I don't know what young, especially second generation or third generation Mexicans feel, especially going through these public school systems. They might just electing someone like Claudia Sheinbaum or whatever her name is as a communist and Mexican president might be just right up their alley. So you get the best of both worlds. You get to live as a sojourner and work and live in the United States, denounce its institutions, but be the proud alien of sorts and celebrate what you think is even more noble in Mexico, even though you don't want to live through the actual conditions present there. And what was the fourth country you mentioned?
Palestine.
Oh, well, yeah, with Palestine, one could be just simply on the right side and recognize the victimization going on there. So, I'm not going to upbraid or scold Max Blumenthal or Anya Parampil for putting the Palestine flag, or Glenn Greenwald if he ever happened to do that.
Those are the big four this decade that you see.
Yeah. So speaking
And
of
America might be 3 in that list. I've probably seen more Ukraine and Mexico flags this decade
for sure.
than American.
Yes. You fly that American flag, you might as well put a Trump flag next to it, is the climate here.
Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Well, the second take I had from your experience on Mexican Independence Day, by the way, there was a whole Seinfeld about how they get stuck in traffic on Puerto Rican Independence Day you might want to check out. But it's the second and last episode of the entire series, by the way. It's a nice segue into the treatment that you had by the cops, how we have this illusion that because we have a police force that we're all subsidizing through our tax dollars, that we're going to be treated in an egalitarian way, in a fair and objective fashion, and not suffer from one group of people getting preferential treatment over another. This is the whole idea of having a constabulary force, a police force that is paid for, owned, and directed by the state. And yet, as Hans-Hermann Hoppe points out in large part in this great essay that was inspired, I was inspired to read this essay, What Must Be Done by Triple H. The reason I did that was because in my time with Robbie the Fire Bernstein on Run Your Mouth podcast, we went through this philosophical argument about, well, what's to be done given the political system that persists to this day, about how do we negotiate in an arena wherein we're arguing for decentralization and subsidiarity, and all around us, the institutions that are most powerful keep growing and growing and get more centralized and thus more distant from people themselves. And he said, well, what can be done about that? Is it going back to ironically limited but also absolute monarchies? Because absolute monarchies were told what had exercise unlimited power, but the truth is they didn't exercise anywhere near the power of modern centralized democratic states. Or is there another way? And Hans-Hermann Hoppe laid out 27 years ago. Think about this. This essay is from a speech given at the Mises Institute for at a Mises Institute conference in Newport Beach, California in 1997. Think about how things have digressed since then and devolved since then. It's a wonderful piece. Let's go through it a little bit to get people the gist and what stands out. And I'm interested to hear what your take was.
Can I tell you another cop story right before this?
Oh, sure. Go ahead. Yeah, I'm sure it's going to help out. Actually.
TSA, DFW. They didn't have this in O'Hare, but I've seen this in other airports.
Mm-hmm.
When you give your ID to the TSA agent right before security, usually they do ID and boarding pass. Now what they're doing is they're doing ID and then there's like a face scan. There's like a picture taken of you
Oh, wow.
right in front. There's just a camera right there. And then right below it, it says picture is optional. You don't need to have your picture taken. So I said,
ask for your consent to have your picture taken.
no, it's just the camera's there, but you can say, please, it says something like, please let a TSA agent know if you don't want picture taken. And I'm shocked that not everyone is just saying no. But I'm up in line and I give her my ID. I said, I don't want my picture taken. And she rolls her eyes at me and she says, what other cameras do you want me to turn off? Picture, she said, as she says under her breath, pictures already been taken, basically, because there's cameras everywhere. And the best part about it is she had to click like 3 more things on her computer. And then she just hands me my ID and I go along with the rest of my day.
So she was really put out.
Yeah. I was making her work overtime there.
Right.
By doing that.
Mm-hmm.
So that was just another outstanding experience with a federal government employee. I happen to stack a lot of those up. Just if I could work with a federal government employee every day, my life would be much better.
Yeah. Well, along those same lines, what I find is the genius of this piece and why our accounts of both Mexican Independence Day and your time in Dallas-Fort Worth Airport are so apropos and fitting for really getting into the nitty-gritty of this essay is that what I love about it is it's this brilliant distillation of theory and then very practical means by which to attain the objectives outlined in the theory. And why I find that so edifying, I should say, I guess that's the best descriptor, is edifying and informative too, is because it fits with his conclusion, namely that if anything's going to get done, the ideological battle has to be won. And whenever you're trying to win an ideological battle, you have to combine not just the theoretical and thought experiments and the philosophical. We have to do it by outlining what are the practical steps to have that theory tested, or the worth and value, the worthiness of the theory as it's possibly in the future or has in the past been applied. That's why I found it so, and of course Hans-Hermann Hoppe, he doesn't pull any punches at all. He's such a brilliant and eloquent writer, and he just gets right to the point. And to think that this was a speech and lecture, and then later uh, set down to paper and ink, uh, is really indicative of the type of genius we're dealing with. Who the man who I argue is the greatest political theorist and standard bearer for anarcho-capitalism alive today, for sure, in my mind. I mean, you could say Rothbard during his lifetime, but I can't think of another person who would challenge Hans-Hermann Hoppe on this front. So the first thing he starts off with in the essay is just the section of helping us to realize the nature of society and its inherent characteristic of cooperation. And the beauty of recognizing this, and we're going to get to one of Charlie's, I won't say critiques of the essay, but more so not even a point of contention, but a point of challenge for Hans-Hermann Hoppe in a moment. And I hope you'll even feel free to vocalize this after I make this point. He makes the argument, he says, self-interest, that is, to prefer more over less, is entirely sufficient to explain the phenomenon of cooperation. Men cooperate because they are able to recognize that production under division of labor is more productive than self-sufficient isolation. Myself working in an atomized way by myself to build a toaster is never going to get done. However, in the web of the almost innumerable relations that exist within society and the economic system, so long as entrepreneurialism, even at a type of trickle level, is taking place, I'm able to obtain a toaster in no time with little to almost no effort. That should be self-explanatory. And yet, people are still hung up on either wanting that type of individual atomism and self-sufficiency and divorcing themselves from that, or because they've been so indoctrinated and propagandized as to thinking that some third party has to be involved in protecting me from being bilked or being sold a bad toaster or a faulty pencil and then me getting scammed as a result of it with no recourse, or that the initial input of or the initial impulse of human beings in a Hobbesian sense is for just us to tear each other apart. Well, there's got to be some third party there to referee, to ensure that the exchange and the cooperation is mutual, or that it's to some basic, although never defined degree, beneficial and positive. And of course, he then goes to say, yeah, I love this quote. He says, Thomas Hobbes assumed that people would be permanently at each other's throats if it were not for some independent third party, that is the state, of course, to make peace among them. Now you notice immediately what kind of curious construction this is. People are assumed to be bad wolves, and that they can be turned into sheep if another third wolf is made to rule above them. If this third party is also a wolf, as obviously he must be, then even he can make peace between two individuals. This obviously implies that there would be a permanent war between the ruling wolf and the two wolves that are now peacefully cooperating with each other. And he goes on to say that that third wolf that's pulled in to oversee exchange and cooperation, because they don't offer anything in the relationship, they're always going to fill a usurpative role and then try to justify that usurpative role by constantly fomenting division between the otherwise two peacefully coordinated actors. Is there anything that is a greater absurdity that's taught and drilled into the minds of Americans, both in and out of educational institutions, than that fallacy?
No.
I like, I like it. I like it. He goes on to say what this boils down to is he's not the best color man in the league for nothing, folks.
Yeah,
What this boils down to, this is Hans-Hermann Hoppe again from page 2. So this is early on again in the essay. What this boils down to is simply that peaceful cooperation between humans is a perfectly natural and constantly re-emerging phenomenon. And out of this cooperation then, and equally naturally and equally driven by self-interest, comes capital formation and money, the medium of exchange, and then the division of labor ultimately expands to the entire globe. And likewise, money, commodity money, also becomes a worldwide used commodity money. Material living standards increase for everyone, thanks to this division of labor and mutual cooperative environment. And based on higher material living standards, an ever more elaborate superstructure of non-material goods, that is civilization, science, the arts, literature, and so forth, can be developed and maintained. Then I want you to comment after this upon what I had alluded to before about your, again, contention or something that you would like to have included within the essay.
sure.
He goes on to
What
say,
page are you on?
I'm on page 2. So I'm at the end where the section begins, protection in the
Yep, I
state.
got it. Yep.
Okay, so then he says, and I'll leave this here for you to then comment on. But something can and obviously has happened that disrupts and distorts and even derails this normal self-interest driven development. And this, of course, is the state, which I will define initially, rather abstractly, as a compulsorily funded,
Compulsorily.
compulsorily,
Compulsorily.
okay,
Compulsorily.
okay, we'll go with that. Compulsorily funded territorial monopolist of protection. He could have just said compulsory, couldn't he have? Okay. That is a monopolist of defense and the provision of enforcement of law and order. I want to go back to even before we started recording. You had said something about what you wish would have been more included, not just implied and in the background of the essay.
Yeah, so with a lot of these libertarian ANCAP articles, arguments, I get pretty bored if there's no mention of God, because I think that the arguments for the existence of God and then for the church are just more important than libertarian ANCAP arguments. And I get a little bored reading these types of pieces now, especially if there's no mention.
So you would almost go so far as to say that there's an inherent need, especially to a Catholic libertarian Austrian economics oriented audience, to there ought to be a work that bridges and really not just implies but expressly celebrates the connection, the inherent connections between the truth of Catholicism and Austrian economics, anarcho-capitalism, these theories and ideologies that pertain to the elimination of the state and the correct definition of it as a compulsory institution that degrades human liberties, but more so serves as a wrench into the free-flowing functions of society.
Yes. And when was this written?
1997.
Okay, so that too. If I think my stance might be a little different if it was 27 years ago, but I just think we're living in such soulless times that
Sure.
these straight let's put it this way. I rather listen to Catholic Church pro versus con debates than
Mm.
anarchism versus minarchism. It's just kind of silly to me.
Sure, but I would challenge you on that and push back in that what I said to you prior when you raised this point prior to recording is that, of course, a simple question that ought to be at the forefront of the minds of anyone reading this, and I'm almost certain that it was also on the mind of Hoppe when he gave the speech is you'd have to have the question, well, who arranged it like this? I mean, what it is amazing that, and this is what Murray Rothbard, I say this over and over again, referred to as the miracle of the market, the miracle that is civilization, and how our self-interests, which could, from one vein and one perspective, be seen as entirely egotistical or entirely self-consumed or atomistic. But in order for them to truly flourish, or to be, or our most lofty and imaginative goals to be attained, or our lifestyles that we find to be the most elevated, where we have civilization that has the arts and literature and music and you name it, it can only take place through mutual, consensual, voluntary cooperation. Well, that seems like some entity has orchestrated it that way. And of course, in a very Thomistic sense, I'm going to say, and everyone knows that's God, right?
Right.
And then, I mean, what I love too about anarcho-capitalist theory, even again, if we're not going to talk in this essay directly about theology, the origin of social order and cooperation, and why it exists as such. I mean, I love how the very core beliefs, but values also are so of a Christian, of a believer, let's just say a theist for that matter, in the traditional sense, are really seen as the same as anyone who would like to see a just society prevail with prudent individuals who are not avaricious, but temperate in nature, who practice patience because they're willing to forego immediate pleasure and have a low time preference. And that builds up capital goods. That in turn leads to human flourishing and the division of labor, which highlights and allows the symphony of people's very, very diverse talents, abilities, and gifts, as well as their passions, to be beneficial beyond themselves. So whatever I read, see, whereas you saw the absence of direct reference to God as, I wouldn't say a limiting factor of the essay, I'm reading God into this, and I don't think, and nor do I care if Hoppe would object. So let me give you an example. On page 4, he states something that is altogether self-evident in my mind about the government, about the state. He says, and this is in the first paragraph, not the first full paragraph on page 4. He writes or spoke of at that time, justice will be perverted in any system wherein the state feigns as being the ultimate protector of individual rights and liberties. Justice will be perverted, and the protector becomes increasingly an exploiter and an expropriator. More specifically, as the result of the territorial monopolization of protection. Now, this is where he's taking off from his first point that what has allowed for the creation of the entity of what we would call the state rather than organic governance based on, as a later term, natural elites. We turn to a third entity as the entity by which we seek and hope that it provides, although it's a rather irrational hope, some level of protection, and we call that the state. So he says, but the nature of that third party, that third wolf, if you will, always moves in order to increase and aggrandize itself toward territorial monopolization of protection. So notice how guarded any government that we recognize as a state today is of being the only protective entity within it, and how it disavows and even disallows any form of alternative protective services. And the institutions of the state demean, bemoan, and then deride uh, any challenges to it. I was thinking as I was reading this about how when Theo Epstein, the former president of the Chicago Cubs, when he moved from Boston to Chicago during his time as GM and then president of the Cubs, he and Jed Hoyer and the other Cubs executives that worked with him in the front office, they moved onto a street called Sunnyside, just west of Southport in Wrigleyville, like West Lakeview, right? And there was all of this consternation and kind of brow raising that was going on at the time because the Cubs executives hired an outside security firm for the street. And when Theo Epstein was asked about it, he gave a very political response, but that political response veiled what was really going on. He said, well, anyone with the means by which we have, and we have considerable means thanks to the Ricketts family and the Cubs in our profession, would like to see their family protected to the utmost degree, and that's why we have this outside security firm. But of course, behind that is he's just saying, look, I don't trust the Chicago police to protect my family on this street, so I hired an outside source. And there were moans and groans, like, of the police precinct there. Although what's interesting too, I think that those were tempered down because either there were people who were largely supportive and fans of what Epstein was doing to revitalize the Cubs, and especially after he won a World Series after 108 years, that tempered any angst that they might have directed his way or communicated in that vein. But I mean, also, it means that they don't have to patrol that street as much. So from the perspective of a patrolman, they don't care. The perspective of Tom Tunney and the aldermen and the politicians, they cared because it struck at their whole monopoly of protection. Okay, so I'm sorry. He goes on to say, he says, again, more specifically, as a result of the territorial monopolization of protection, two tendencies are generated. I think this is the crux of the essay, by the way. He says, first, there's a tendency toward the extensification of exploitation. And second, a tendency toward the intensification of exploitation. So what he means by that, extensification of exploitation, well, once you are that entity that has a monopoly of violence and protection over a given territory, you're going to intensify your efforts to increase the territory, because with the increase in territory, you have more power over those entities, and you can usurp and steal and plunder more from more people, right? But then it's followed up by, once the states in question determine that their expansion is either blocked in a realistic and practical sense, or that they've exhausted enough resources toward that extensification, they then turn inward and intensify the exploitation of the domestic population therein. I mean, is that not the history of the United States? What's wild, though, is that, especially after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, it's as though we've embarked, and this is why it's been so catastrophic for the American middle class, is that the regimes that have followed have not simply, in a departure from hubris and pride and insanity, said we should be satisfied and we should try to build up and intensify the livelihoods and the prosperity of people who had already through generations suffered to attain this end of defeating by and large worldwide communism and its greatest exponent. But no, let's instead go on a wild regime change series of wars to in to follow the goal of extensification of exploitation. In order to do all that, we need to intensify the exploitation at home. I mean, that's the formula, isn't it? All the while, you have all these regimes and politicians saying about how they're improving your lives, where in reality, largely through monetary policy, but also through taxation and regulation and further encroachments of the state upon the various municipal and subsidiary levels of government. Well, that's what's going on. Any thoughts there?
I want to tell you my favorite part of this article.
Yeah, please.
It's on the same page, 4.
Oh, okay.
The monarchy versus democracy segment.
Uh-huh.
I thought was beautiful. And I'm not advocating that we just throw in a king tomorrow, but the idea that, and I'll read some of this. Popular resistance against expansion of state power will be very high if there is a single person in charge, because there is obviously no free entry into the state apparatus, and the benefits of the monopoly accrue to a single man and his extended family. That is the hereditary nobility. Accordingly, the public resentment and vigilance is heightened, and attempts to intensify exploitation find quick and severe limitations. People hated the king because they realized that, quote, he is the ruler and we are ruled by him.
Mm-hmm.
And then down here, it talks about how princes and kings normally have a good measure of natural elite upbringing and value system.
Right.
Versus democratic politicians, on the other hand, are and must be professional demagogues, constantly appealing to even the basest, and that is typically egalitarian instincts, as every vote is obviously as good as any other.
Mm-hmm.
And he talks, I can't find it right now, but he talks about how the problem with democracy is there's a
egalitarianism.
It's a low barrier to entry,
yes.
and everyone, no matter who you are, if you're living in America, you've probably envisioned yourself being the president.
Right. Or you're told in school, anybody could be president.
So you think that that person is more like you.
Mm-hmm. Correct.
Than you would if it was just the son of the dad that was king before.
Yes. Yeah. Here's the quote here that explains your point a bit more. He says, moreover, because entry into a democratic government is open, everyone can become president. Resistance against state property invasions is reduced. This leads to the same result. Increasingly under democratic conditions, the worst will rise to the top of the state in free competition. Competition is not always good. Competition in the field of becoming the shrewdest aggressor against private property is nothing to be greeted. And this is precisely what democracy amounts to. Democracy, in other words, and this is the best definition of democracy, it's the competition in the field of becoming the shrewdest aggressor against private property. And that is it's not ruled by the people. It's the competition in the field of becoming the shrewdest aggressor against private property. And all you have to do is listen to a presidential debate for the past 100 years and realize that that is what they refer to as the best democracy. And even Trump, he's like, when I get in, I'll be better. I'm a businessman. I'll figure it out. That sort of thing. Well, what he's saying is he's just the shrewdest. He's going to win the competition of becoming the best and most efficient aggressor against personal property. I'm going to allocate funds and steal them from you in the most efficient way to the benefit of my particular constituents than ever before, than anyone else has ever done it. See? And that's why you have the duopoly too. The duopoly they're working, and remember their fundamental united value is democracy, this competition of being who can be the best aggressor. And they're just different in who gets the largesse, who gets the spoils. When they're all sucking on the teat of the hog, who gets the hind milk and all the milk in between? Right?
Right.
So we're talking a lot about theory. There's a quick assessment then when he gets into the section on current conditions. Excuse me. And then remember, this is the end of the 20th century. So he's taking stock. And of course, the famous Francis Fukuyama end of history type of thesis was still being bandied about. And this is a bold assessment of what was going on at the time, because it was very comfortable still position to say that the United States emerged as the unipolar power on the world stage, and thus the triumph of liberal democracy had come, and that, well, we should just kind of ride that wave. And what's so bad about trying to inspire revolutions across the world toward aligning other nations and peoples toward this end? And he says, now from an Austro-libertarian point of view, matters have taken a somewhat different turn. Under highly centralized democracy, or let me call it highly centralized mob rule, the security of private property has almost completely disappeared. Now think of that. He's saying that in 1997, right? How much has it truly been eviscerated?
Yeah.
A distant memory now. And what he comes to argue is that the only way, given what we've defined as proper to democracy and modern democracy, to ensure functioning free markets, capitalism, entrepreneurship, is to, whether it's open, it's to be absolutely anti-democratic. He says private property owners are no longer free to include or exclude other people from their property as they see fit. This is the right to include if you want, or exclude if you want. And this is an essential ingredient for private property. And this entails a defense mechanism. It is an anti-invasion method that you can kick people off your property. But this right to kick people off your property, especially commercial property, has been entirely taken away from you. And with this right gone, and no one can hire or fire today, buy or sell, include or exclude from his property at will, with all of this gone, well, this is also another method of defending oneself from invasion. How interesting then, if you just extend that to a macrocosmic level, you have the progressive stance on immigration, right? And if you notice the nature of both, left libertarian arguments about open borders, or progressive arguments of just let anyone in and don't even seek to enculturate them in the most basic American values, because of course that's both hedonistic and racist, but in some way. Well, that's part of the evisceration of and the elimination of this idea of inherent to private property, and the exercise thereof of that property is your ability to include or exclude, right? And he says, as a result of all of this, the state has perverted the public sense of justice and personal responsibility, and bred and attracted an increasing number of moral and economic monsters and monstrosities. Love that. So then we get into strategy. So he has this transition into the current state, what's going on, and how the state has abrogated its role of protector through this method of exploitation. And he goes on to say, well, there's no reason to think that the advance of a defense of private property is ever going to be manifested or be taken up where there's a political system wherein majority rules. He even says so explicitly, and this is on page 6. Majority rule and private property protection are incompatible. The idea of democracy must be ridiculed. It is nothing else but mob rule parading as justice. So, of course, he's getting at the whole dynamic of when you go out to dinner, and this is where the absurdity of democracy, I think, is the most apparent, is if you go out to dinner and I'm with 10 people, we're actually both of us there with 10 people, and all of a sudden at the end of the meal, everybody says, okay, we're going to have a vote as to who should pay. And 9 of the 10 people vote that I should pay. Of course, I sheepishly hold my hand up and say, I want to vote for someone else. Right. Well, in no circumstance would anyone define that as justice. Right. And yet that essentially is what democracy is. Or let's say I have a contingent of people that are concerned about my finances, but that contingent is not large enough to ensure that democracy and an injustice, that justice as opposed to an injustice prevails against me, and the vote comes out 6-4 that I do pay. Well, again, you could structure the Constitution in elaborate ways as we have in the United States, but notice how those fundamental structures that were supposed to protect the voice and rights of the minority have over time naturally degraded to the point that it's just a nub of what it once was in James Madison's vision. Thoughts there?
I don't have many other thoughts.
Okay.
I kind of want to get to the people segment.
All right. Let me then finish up, and I want to conclude with some of the most the things that I found most amazing within the piece. He talks about the disappearance of natural elites that we have to bring back. I love that segment. He has some great quotes here. Oh, none of this is going to be helpful. This ideological war, which he identifies correctly in my mind, it's an ideological war. It all hinges on the ability, ultimately, of whether or not we will succeed in delegitimizing and exposing as an economic and moral perversity democracy and the democratic monopoly of justice and protection. In other words, this is an ideological battle, he goes on to say, and it's going to have to be. Now, this is where I think one might have a valid point of contention from my perspective with him. And he says, of course, academic institutions are gone. And the idea of leading a top-up revolution wherein the very people that are claiming to have all of the wisdom, sagacity, and capacity to continue on being the protective service over individuals operating voluntarily within society, that's not going to work because that would lead to their elimination, and they're admitting that they're non-essential. But he goes on to, he says, look, it's going to have to be a bottoms-up thing. In other words, elect the dog catcher, elect the local representative, the school board, who is willing to, at the microcosmic level, eliminate this myth that the state serves as anything but a usurpative role. He says this could be done. In fact, it could be done because, as it turns out, just like any kind of transformative movement, it starts small and it can easily become the dominant ethos of the day. Without local enforcement, he says, by compliant local authorities, the will of the central government is not much more than hot air. So the kind of snowball effect would get rolling as more and more people recognize that, well, if the absence of my dog catcher in local sense is leading to no great social upheaval and harm, why is it that I need to have a national military that is adventurous and does anything but what it says it does in the Department of Defense? Last points. I kind of remain skeptical of this, and I wonder what Hoppe would say, and maybe you could put yourself in his shoes about if you take for given that the general population, at least in the West, our deference is toward the national government. You know, when there's a disaster, we look to FEMA. You know, we don't look to our neighbor down the street. We don't look to our local government. In fact, we kind of exonerate the local government because we all think they're a bunch of country bumpkins or what have you. When we look for the massive apparatus to help us out from Washington, at least the majority of Americans do, I would assert. What effect do you think COVID federalism, secession movements, and even someone like Javier Milei would have on that? See, from my perspective, that changes the calculus. You remember when we had that episode with what's her face, Kalina George, and we were talking about the strategy of the Mises Caucus, which in large part flows from this Hoppian essay, right? Start local, build up, and then have it snowball until people realize and are convinced by the ideology that the state is an aggressor and totally unnecessary, that we would flourish, in fact, without it. Okay, so if that's the decentralized revolution, well, but we have people who are leading broad national movements, and even a tinge of Trumpism is in favor of federalism, right? So how would he change his calculus here? I'd love to ask him that question. Like, in other words, yes, Argentina is a special situation because the economy was so destroyed by inflationary policy for so long, right? And the culture maimed by it. That allows for the emergence of Milei. But wouldn't you argue that Milei did more in a day than all the dog catcher elections or libertarian councilmen that were elected through the Mises Caucus?
More in a day?
Sure. Just by his being elected, right? That means that there's an appetite for it. And being as tribal and as unwilling to go it alone as people largely are, whether it's through an evolutionary biology cause or whatever, herd mentality, status quo, bias, whatever it might be. Once people look around and say, "Oh shit, we got an anarcho-capitalist who is the president now," he did more elevating him. I think did even more for libertarianism and anarcho-capitalism in America than any anarcho-capitalist has done in America outside of maybe Ron Paul. So I think that just changes the calculus a little bit. In other words, you could have, I don't think it has to be exclusive. If there was a strategy going forward, I would pick people who are prominent in, it doesn't even have to be in politics, it could be in society. Imagine what the effect would be if Candace Owens read Ludwig von Mises and became an anarcho-capitalist. Or if Tucker was moved away from his stupid economics regarding protectionism and became Rothbardian. That would do more. Those two, let's call them conversions, would do more than getting one libertarian elected to the Wichita City Council. Anyway, I would encourage people to read stuff from Hoppe. I mean, the excerpts that we read were kind of heady, but the way he explains things is very accessible. So I really want to encourage. Should we go to a place where no one's reading Hans-Hermann Hoppe? In fact, I think there's got to be a bonfire of, if it was ever found, Democracy, the God That Failed, or anything like that. Let's get to it. The people.
Here it is.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
Should we go to your gay suburb now?
I've been waiting for this story for a while now. Skaman Parakat to compete in race for OP Village President.
Get the t-shirts out. We got to get the t-shirts.
Local elections will be held April 1, 2025.
Man, does she have a horse face? Urgh.
Village President Vicky Skaven and Trustee Ravi Parakat are each running to fill the seat of Oak Park's village president for 4 years after the local election April 1, 2025. Skaven and Parakat have served in their respective roles since the last election for their seats in 2021. Wednesday Journal is not yet aware of any other candidates for village president.
Are there really any other?
To get on the ballot, each potential candidate will have to acquire a certain number of signatures from Oak Park residents qualified to vote based on a percentage of voter turnout in the last regular municipal election. The filing dates are November 12th to 18th. Parakat, I think that's his name. We just call him Ravi. For people that don't know, he's the guy that we always talk about. Ravi, I'm just going to call him Ravi. Ravi said he's not running against anybody, but rather for a vision of Oak Park that he believes he shares with most residents. A safe, affordable, sustainable, and inclusive Oak Park. The last few years, the village board has spent a lot of time on topics outside of the goals members have set. He said that if elected, he wants to make sure an agenda is set according to the board goals using fact-based, comprehensive studies to move forward.
Fact-based in Oak Park. What?
Quote, we've had meetings that go long hours without really moving the community forward, he said.
Understatement of all of history.
I personally don't have any interest in sitting and discussing a distracted agenda, which I think is a waste of board time and the community's time.
Or we even had village presidents just get up because they made up being assaulted.
When agendas are aligned with board goals, Parakat said that there's less contention and discussions are shorter. The longer meetings come from topics that deviate from those goals with no clear consensus, he said. If elected, Ravi said he'd work to build consensus early on and keep goals to a manageable number so village staff can also know what to expect. Quote, when you have a lot of board goals, you can call it ambitious, but that's a euphemism for lack of focus, he said. You don't end up accomplishing much.
Got to have the conversation, Ravi. This is Oak Park after all.
This Ravi guy might turn it around.
Yeah.
Skaman said, quote, the insinuation that I always anticipated running for 2 terms is kind of true. It takes time to finish what you started, she said.
Weird statement.
I do firmly believe that my skill set is still the leadership style that our community needs right now to advance the goals that we have, she said.
Meandering and going nowhere.
Valuing the other trustees' input is key, Skaman said. Her overarching goal as village president has been to ensure more people feel heard and in communication with the government, she said. The community was more divided before her leadership than it is now, she said. Skaman describes her leadership style as, quote, servant style.
Oh, God.
She said she works to understand multiple perspectives and host complex conversations at the board table, appreciating the vast nuances that often emerge in discussions. The village still needs that, she said.
No,
Quote,
it doesn't.
my leadership style is undeniably about collective impact and bringing different voices together to fully vet decisions and ultimately decrease our division, she said, and identify where it is that we agree most and then move forward from there.
Mm-hmm.
Key issues. Skaman said the key issues she'd like to address if reelected are the issues she's already been working on, such as sustainability, economic vitality, and affordability.
Sustainability.
Oak Park is a regional leader in sustainability, said Skaman, pointing out the village receiving a gold designation in the EV readiness program in 2023. Under her leadership, she said the village has worked with other local entities such as the Park District, the Oak Park Public Library, schools, and other neighboring communities to further emphasize sustainability advancements. Small business development is another priority.
Because they never define sustainability. Go ahead.
Small business development is another priority for Skaman, as well as diversifying housing stock, perhaps through expanding missing middle housing, defined as, quote, a range of house scale buildings with multiple units, compatible in scale and form with detached single family homes, located in a walkable neighborhood.
15-minute cities. Yay!
Quote, when you walk into the village of Oak Park, you know this is a community that's prepared for the future, she said. Part of what makes Oak Park amazing is the diversity of all types that we have in our community. With development also comes the need for sustainable practices, Skaman said, such as the electrification ordinance the current board approved that required new buildings constructed after January 1, 2024 to be
Now,
fully
I'm in favor
electric.
of I am in favor of the electrification of all of the current board. Oh, is that not the policy?
No, that's not.
That's different.
not what she said.
Ooh.
Skaman also said since affordability is a common goal on the current board, budgeting has become more strategic under her direction. The board has been working to create specific policies to instill into the process for future boards, also ensuring increased transparency. Quote, we've got that consistency of this process of understanding how our levy is going to affect everyday Oak Parkers, she said. It feels like we're working together more. It's also a priority for Skaman to work to be proactive in addressing issues in the community rather than reactive, like with traffic concerns or community safety. Ravi. Ravi said he has 3 focus areas for his campaign: safety, affordability, and community development. In terms of safety, Ravi said ensuring the police department is properly staffed and implementing recommendations in the Barry Dunn study are key priorities. Another is ensuring the alternative police response to calls for service program is built out, as well as investing in technology and infrastructure. In terms of affordability, Ravi said he wants to focus not only on responsible tax levy and use, but also on ensuring residents of all backgrounds receive the, quote, expected value for the taxes they pay. A lot of people who come to Oak Park find value in the school system for their kids, he said, but plenty of residents are in other stages of life, and he said he'd like them to find the same value. Oak Park is one of the largest amounts of affordable housing stock in the state, he said, but the village is also missing the people in the middle of the affordability spectrum, Ravi said. In addition to that focus area, it's equally important that trustees contemplate use of taxpayer dollars with just as much consideration as they would their own finances, he said.
Oh, man.
In terms of community development, Ravi said he wants to focus on sustainability and equity. He said he wants to work on an economic vitality plan and world-class infrastructure while not losing sight of core municipal functions such as fixing alleys or streamlining trash collection. Quote, rather than looking back, looking forward into the future and building the world that we want to see in our community, he said. Okay, I'm not even going to read the experience part because it goes into just a bunch of weird resume stuff.
Yeah, that's okay. We got the perspectives. One guy actually wants to accomplish stuff. All, yes, of course, with the obsequious nod to equity and inclusion, but at least he wants to get things done without going nowhere conversations. And the other one just wants to talk about things.
Ravi, contrasting candidates. Ravi said the upcoming local election is a question of focus, experience, and effectiveness. He said he hasn't seen that evidenced recently. Some of the discussions that Ravi said diverted the board from its goals were discussions on the fall leaf collection, the village hall remodel, and to some extent, the migrant crisis.
All covered here on Hot Water History.
Absolutely. The migrant crisis came to the village board unexpectedly, Ravi said, and had an emergent nature. But leaving that crisis aside, he said the others, quote, not only did not contribute to us moving forward, they actively are hindering us in pursuing our goals.
Right.
There may be some surprises the village board has to react to, Ravi said, but most items should be clear. When a new board sits, there's a facilitated goal-setting process with the village manager. Ravi said he thinks that is the time to go back and forth, understand everyone's commitments to the community, backgrounds, and perspectives in order to arrive at reasonable goals. It's important, Ravi emphasized, to create that shared basis for consensus up front, give clear direction to village staff, and not change direction at, quote, the drop of a hat. Skaman said she's navigated difficult conversations by genuinely listening to the community and her colleagues. She said she thinks Ravi feels he can narrow an agenda to match his own.
Ooh, that's...
Quote, what I do know from my experience working with him at the board table is that his reaction to an agenda that doesn't perfectly match his is that it, to him, apparently feels like a waste of time, she said.
Oh, God, straw man.
Skaman said she's proud of the village's migrant response. It was an emergency, and people count on the government at every level to be responsive.
People count on the government at every level to be responsive. Yeah, yep.
Where was I?
Oak
It was
Park
an emergency. Oak Park chose to help. She said the board had lengthy discussions regarding the nuance of funding for the crisis. She said, but without that time spent, the issue could have divided them like it tends to nationally. Sometimes responding to an emergency means, however, that other issues have to be put on pause.
Yeah, for the actual residents of Oak Park.
Quote, we could either be part of the solution or we can make it worse, she said. And she said she won't apologize for the extra time it took to respect all positions and come together to respond. Quote, it was an actual emergency of which it would have been a failure of our jobs to have not responded, she said. In terms of the discussions about changes to leaf collection procedures, Skaman said it was once again important for the board to respond to community concerns, including safety considerations. She said she felt Ravi was unclear on his position regarding leaf collection and options presented by staff.
Obviously, a disqualifying position for the village manager. Leaf collection.
Quote, potentially he should reflect upon how it is that he might have handled it differently as village president, she said, referring to both issues. I feel that I have an obligation to value the perspectives of my colleagues, to not host conversations in a way that provides some space to speak and have their sometimes differing opinions is not valuing the residents of Oak Park. That is going to mean longer meetings sometimes. And the board can't ignore the renovation issues at Village Hall either, she said. It's not accessible and the police station is in desperate need of change. Quote, every single member of the board loves Oak Park and wants to do right by Oak Park, she said. But to be a successful village president, Skaman said one has to be able to work with others. Skaman, like Ravi, said she's not running against her opponent, but rather she said she's running to continue the work she's already doing. That includes allowing for the board to occasionally agree to disagree, but figure out how to work together. It includes understanding why there might be disagreement and constantly growing in perspective. Quote, unfortunately, Trustee Paracott is the exception, she said, but that's by his choice.
Oh, a little parting shot. Whatever. I want to throw out that we could just officially now recommend that, and this is to all of the Oak Parkers voting in the upcoming municipal elections in April, we are officially endorsing Vicky Skaman.
Yeah.
And because you hate us so much, that means you have to vote for Ravi Paracott.
Right. That's a good strategy.
Yeah. Very good.
All right.
That's it.
That's
that was.
segment.
Meanwhile in Oak Park.
What would have happened if I'd gone for it and just said, no, I'm gay. The people's favorite segment.
Okay. Go
Awesome.
out, buy Trinitine Brewing stuff. Go to Mass. Continue your process of theosis, of being made into the divine Godhead. What else?
That's it.
That's it.
Not gonna one up that.
All right. And recognize that the state is a hindrance to both your earthly happiness and eternal joy. There you go.
Amen. All right, everyone.
God bless.
Goodbye.
Peace.